Perfect. Awesome. Let me share my screen. Doo-doo-doo. Does this look good for everyone? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me here today. I'm just thrilled to be here at the NIST Falcon series and seeing some familiar faces and meeting a lot of new people. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all today. So the topic is to explore best practices for highlighting counter-stereotypical scientists in undergraduate STEM courses. Um, and before jumping into it, I always like to start by introducing myself, which I know Siley just did. But in the vein of highlighting scientists, I want to share a little bit more about myself. So I completed a PhD in behavioral ecology, evolutionary biology at the University of Virginia. I did my field work at a field station in the southwest portion of Virginia, where I studied the ecological causes and adaptive consequences of social behaviors in forked fungus beetles. My research focus shifted quite a bit for my postdoc towards conducting biology education research, which I did at Auburn University with Sissy Ballin. And broadly, my research works to identify the barriers that students face in their post-secondary biology courses, and then empirically identify classroom interventions aimed at helping students overcome those barriers. And to date, most of the classroom interventions that I have evaluated have focused on highlighting counter-stereotypical scientists in post-secondary biology courses. And now I'm an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo, where I continue to conduct this type of research. So one of the reasons I like to introduce myself this way is I like to emphasize just how I introduce myself, which I provided a narrative that was really linear and focused on my individual successes in science. And I could have provided information about myself that really counters the stereotypical representation of scientists. I could have mentioned the many research setbacks that I've experienced along the way. I could have acknowledged the many supportive mentors and collaborators that I've had the good fortune to work with. And I also could have provided more context of what I like to do outside of science, which includes running, traveling to hike in the mountains, fostering puppies from the SPCA, reading, and so on. And so today's topic for our interactive discussion is going to explore the impact of sharing this different type of information that counters the stereotypical representation of scientists with our students in our undergraduate STEM courses. Let me get rid of this guy. Okay. So to begin this conversation, I just want to hear from you all. So what are your experiences with featuring counter-stereotypical scientists in your STEM courses? If you do feature scientists, how do you do so? And if not, what are some of the barriers for doing so? And so today we're going to utilize breakout rooms. So we'll send you out into your breakout rooms. And when you get to your breakout rooms, please introduce yourself. And then we'll spend about 4 minutes discussing this topic that I'll also paste in the chat. And when we come back, have one person from your group be ready to share out with the rest of us of what you all talked about in terms of your experiences featuring counter-stereotypical scientists. Okay.
I am ready as soon as you post your. Do you want to post prompts in the chat?
Yeah, I'm. One moment. Okay. Here.
Awesome.
Get the next one ready.
All right, activating breakout rooms now.
In a few minutes.
Oh, open all rooms. Christy, if you're looking for a breakout room, you're in room 1. And Nadia, you're in room 2. right, there we go. Okay, and then 3:08. So I'll close them at about 3:12. Sorry,
Cool.
yeah, 3:12.
Yeah, we'll see how much I'm rushing at the end of it.
Yeah, and I try to join breakout rooms myself. Oh, well, maybe I should go. I'll go to room 4 because there's only 3 people in there.
Mm.
Actually, no, room 6 because there's only 2 people in there. I'll be back. I'll
Okay.
make sure I come back and then close the room in 2 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Hey Mariah, we're in breakout rooms, which is why this feels very weird. But they should be coming back in like 2 minutes, so I can just tell you the prompt, and then the next breakout room you can join. What everyone's been asked to think about is what are your experiences featuring counter stereotypical scientists in your courses?
I just realized you didn't hear anything I said. Um, so sorry I was late. I was doing something and I was like, oh, crud, I had something going on at one. So anyway,
Yeah,
I'm
no
here.
worries.
Sorry
I
about
fully
that.
understand.
Okay, I'm gonna close the rooms now.
Perfect.
and they have 60 seconds. So uh, they're they're having good discussions. I was in the room with,
Yeah.
I think it might be your PhD student.
They're not my students, but they're at Buffalo. Yeah.
Oh, they're at Buffalo. Okay, all right. Okay, 30 more seconds and everyone will be back. Yeah, I think everyone is coming back right now.
Awesome. Welcome back. Um, yeah, would a couple of people be willing to volunteer to share some of the experiences that you all were discussing in your breakout rooms? Or alternatively, post in the chat if that feels more comfortable.
I can share about ours. I started out by talking about some barriers in terms of the the usual issue with some intro classes trying to cover content and also not having examples. And one of our breakout room members is in geo spatial stuff, and so she was saying that the textbooks are written from a white male perspective and don't really have examples of other people who are not white male. And then we also, she talked about using alumni from their department as examples. So they have created their own database of scientist spotlights of alumni.
That's awesome. Yeah, so some ways of getting around kind of the limitations that exist currently. Very cool. Thank you, Latanya. Are there other anyone else want to report back?
All right, I'll just start. Two of us don't really, including myself, didn't really have any experience with it. We were just kind of here, just kind of seeing, what it's all about. And then the other two, actually, one has a lot of experience because they're part of a community college. I think that's developed a website that has over 1,000 spotlight scientists, and they utilize it in the classroom, having students actually being the ones who propose most of the spotlights. So they have they give their students assignment. They have to go out and find a scientist that they, either connect with or find interesting. And they, add it to this archive on the website. And then lastly, I believe one of the instructors also was utilizing it, but lately has been having difficulties, I think, with students subverting the actual meat of the assignment by utilizing AI. So the AI, I think, is going out and finding the scientists that the students are, which I mean, it could be useful, but also I think cuts out the main reason for that instructor utilizing the assignment. So that's what
Oh,
we.
very interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, Scientist Spotlights is an awesome resource, and yeah, thinking about how to continue to utilize those resources in current AI world we live in is really fascinating. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm gonna continue on, but if you have more experiences that weren't represented that you want to share in the chat, like feel free to. Okay, going back. Alrighty. Okay, so thank you for sharing. And yeah, I hope these different experiences can help inform the remainder of our discussion today. And something that Latanya said is like she knew what slide was coming next. The reason that it's important for us to be discussing how to highlight counter-stereotypical scientists in our classrooms is based in this unfortunate reality, and that's that the diversity of the scientific community is not represented in our undergraduate educational resources. And previous work used textual analysis, specifically of biology textbooks that are commonly used in our undergraduate courses, and found that the scientists who are featured in these textbooks are overwhelmingly men, and specifically white men. And we can see from this figure that the proportion of women scientists has increased through time. However, when we additionally categorize these scientists by their race ethnicity, we see that the gains in textbook representation have been made almost exclusively by white women. So all of this is to say is that the majority of scientists who are featured in our textbooks, and in this case specifically biology textbooks, don't match the identities of many of the students who are reached by these educational resources. And we can see the repercussions of the representation of scientists as white men in our textbooks and how students describe scientists. When they're asked to think of scientists, they typically list these famous scientists like Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, Isaac Newton. And when asked to draw a picture of a scientist, students of all ages typically draw a scientist that looks something like this. And so these different images can help us understand how students think of the stereotypical scientist. This is a white man who holds identities, or sorry, who is brilliant and just devoted to science. And so in contrast, a counter-stereotypical scientist is going to be someone who holds identities who have historically been and continue to be excluded from STEM, who have interests outside of science, and who have had to overcome struggles within science. And a growing body of literature really documents why it's important to highlight counter-stereotypical scientists, and again, specifically in biology classrooms. So in courses that do highlight counter-stereotypical scientists, we see shifts in students' stereotypes and perceptions of who can do science. We see increases in students' science identity, as well as in their ability to relate to scientists. We see that students are engaging more with course materials and also have improved academic performance, improved course grades. And these numerous benefits, these numerous positive impacts really hold across different educational contexts. We see these positive impacts in both secondary school and post-secondary schools, as well as for students who hold different identities, including first-generation students and women. And so given the importance of highlighting counter-stereotypical scientists in biology courses, although this holds across STEM fields, a long list of resources have evidence-based resources have been developed and evaluated that feature counter-stereotypical scientists. So some of these resources include scientist spotlights, like Evan was just mentioning, biography, the Story Collider podcast, as well as Dataversify, Data Nuggets, and Project Biodiversify. And all of these resources feature counter-stereotypical scientists in different ways. So they can vary in the number of identities that they disclose about the featured scientists. They can vary in the number of modes that they use to highlight the scientists. So some of these resources include videos of the scientists, where others include photographs or text. And they also vary in how long they ask students to engage with the resource. And then furthermore, instructors can vary in how they integrate these resources or how they highlight counter-stereotypical scientists in their courses. So like we were discussing earlier, there's lots of different ways of approaching this. And some ways that instructors vary in how they integrate these resources. Some instructors may vary in how often they highlight scientists, vary in the diversity of identities that they incorporate into their courses, and in the ways that they integrate counter-stereotypical scientists into their curriculum. And so given this wide range in how counter-stereotypical scientists are featured in our undergraduate STEM courses, some colleagues and I really wanted to understand what are the features of counter-stereotypical scientists, or of these resources that highlight counter-stereotypical scientists that are responsible for creating these changes that we see in student attitudes towards scientists and towards science. So in other words, we really wanted to know, what is the secret sauce that makes these counter-stereotypical scientist curricular interventions so effective at improving equitable outcomes in STEM? So I want to hear what you all think. So as before, we're going to break out into our breakout rooms. What are the features of counter-stereotypical scientists that you think are responsible for creating change? And when answering this question, think about your scientist role models when you were an undergraduate for inspiration. Okay. And so here is the prompt.
Right, and I'm opening up all of the rooms Same people in all of the rooms, and they're open now. Okay.
Okay, welcome back. I'd love to hear from a couple groups of some of the features that you think might be responsible for creating change in student attitudes.
So I can speak for our group, and we thought two ideas. One would be if the fact that the scientists actually struggled and it didn't just all come easily would make them relatable. And then some aspect of the identity that the students could relate to. Like for us, a Native American student really wants to know about a Native American scientist, for example.
Yeah, different ways to make the scientists relatable, whether that's identities or struggling, totally. Any other ideas that came up in your groups?
Our group talked about the humanizing aspects of not necessarily just about being brilliant or just about what they did scientifically, but about the other parts of their personalities or experiences.
Yeah, totally. Cool. In the sake of time, I'm gonna move forward and share my screen again. Cool. But if you have other ideas, feel free to throw them in the chat. So yeah, the ideas that you all shared are like completely in line with theoretical expectations. So according to theory, scientists are going to be most effective when they're portrayed as competent and successful, meaningfully similar to students or relatable. So that was kind of the ideas that you all were just sharing. And then also their success needs to be portrayed as attainable. So similar like to this idea of struggle. And so today I'm going to start by sharing some work that investigates this second element. So it investigates which features of these curriculum materials that include scientists impact how students are going to relate to the scientist. And so we used an experimental approach to parse the effects of visual versus humanizing elements. And so what that means, my colleagues and I, we really wanted to know, is it enough to include visual representation of diverse identities of scientists in order for students to relate to those scientists? Or do we need to provide some of that humanizing information for students to relate to scientists? So do we need to emphasize that scientists are relatable or have or normal people by depicting scientists pursuing their interests and hobbies? Or do we need to showcase that the obstacles that scientists have had to overcome to get to where they are today, including things like self-doubt, language barriers, gender transitions? And we dissected these different elements of these materials that feature counter-stereotypical scientists using data-versify materials. And so this is a curricular material. It's designed for undergraduate biology courses that highlights counter-stereotypical scientists and also engages students in developing data literacy skills by using a data set that's collected by the featured scientist. And so in this experiment, we manipulated the extent to which students were exposed to information about these counter-stereotypical scientists in these activities. So in the control treatment, students worked through this quantitative biology activity, working with this data set collected by a scientist, but weren't provided any information about the scientists who collected the data they were working with. In our visual treatment, students were exposed to the same quantitative biology activity, but were also shown a photograph of the researcher who collected the data in the activity. And then finally, in our humanizing treatment, students worked through the same quantitative biology activity, but experienced the full scientist profile. And this scientist profile includes photographs of the scientist as well as a brief Q&A that highlights the humanity of the scientist. And so here's an example of what one of these humanizing scientist profiles looks like. So somewhat similar to how I introduced myself at the beginning of this talk, profiles has multiple photos of the scientists, including photographs of the scientists doing science as well as doing things that aren't science. And the profiles also includes this brief Q&A that asks things about the scientist's favorite part of their job, the obstacles that they've had to overcome to get to where they are, and any dimensions of their identity that they feel are marginalized in STEM. So in this example, Aaron loves doing field biology because it makes him feel like Indiana Jones. He has had to overcome an education quality gap to get to where he is today. And he doesn't see a lot of Black men in science. Sorry, I've been talking a lot, so let me take a sip. Okay, so for this experiment, we recruited 43 biology instructors who teach at across 36 different US undergraduate institutions. And here is a guide of this experimental design. So each instructor applied randomized consecutive treatments across 3 different academic terms. And after each of these quantitative biology activities, students completed a survey that measured how they related to the profiled scientist and then how they engaged with the quantitative biology activity. And we conducted confirmatory factor analysis that revealed 3 different components of our measure of engagement. And so we have affective engagement, which measures how interested the student is in the activity, cognitive engagement, which measures the perceived importance of the activity, and then behavioral engagement, which measures how much effort they're putting into the activity. And so then we used these survey constructs. I have such a tickle, I'm so sorry. I will be okay, I promise. Okay, so we then used these survey constructs to explore which features of these scientists impact how students are relating to the scientists, and then whether the relatability of the scientists then drives student engagement with these course activities. And here we're using structural equation models to test this hypothesis. And so our data from over 3,700 students supports this model and reveals that incorporating these humanizing information about these counter-stereotypical scientists really increase the relatability of the scientists to the students, and that this then translates to greater student engagement in these quantitative biology activities. So we're seeing that students in this humanizing treatment relate or rate the extent to which they relate to scientists 0.15 standard deviations more than students in these other 2 treatments in their control and visual treatments, and that this increased relatability then translates to students finding these quantitative biology activities more interesting, more important, and they're putting more effort into those activities. So in sum, students are engaging more with quantitative biology activities that include humanizing information about the scientists, and that this is driven by increased relatability of those scientists. So given this importance of the relationship between our treatment and the relatability of scientists, our next question was whether this relationship between treatment and relatability depends on the degree to which students are sharing identities with the featured scientist. So we performed a demographic matching analysis, and specifically we were looking at demographic matching between gender and race ethnicity. And so we created 4 different categories of student scientist demographic matching. So students in our excluded double match category hold excluded identities and share those identities with this with the featured scientist. So they share the same gender and race ethnicities as the featured scientist. Students in this excluded single match category hold excluded identities, but only share one of those identities with the featured scientist, so either gender or race ethnicity. Students in this excluded no match category hold excluded identities, but don't share those same identities as the featured scientist. And then students in our non-excluded group are white men students. And again, we're interested in looking at the effect of having these different types of shared identities with the featured scientists on this relationship between our 3 treatments and whether and how relatable they found the scientist. And this is what we found. And so I want to highlight just 3 main points that emerge from this figure. The first, as we see that sharing humanizing information about counter-stereotypical scientists did not impact how students with these non-excluded identities, white men students, related to scientists. But instead, students with excluded identities and with shared excluded identities related most to scientists when humanizing information was provided. And I specifically mentioned students with shared excluded identities because post hoc analyses revealed that students with excluded identities, but identities that they did not share with the featured scientist, did not relate more to that scientist, or significantly more than students with non-excluded identities. We can see here with this like overlapping error bars. And then finally, the third observation is that these activities that included only visual elements, so that only included a photograph of the featured scientist, were not sufficient to create change in how students with shared identities related to the scientists. So taking all this together, these results really emphasize that it's including this humanizing information that's necessary for students to relate to scientists with whom they share excluded identities. And so by simply including these brief scientist profiles that feature humanizing information about scientists, students with identities typically excluded from STEM can see themselves in the work of biologists, can relate to those biologists, and this can then increase their engagement with course content, and specifically in this case with learning quantitative skills. And this story has now been published, and you can access it here on this QR code. And I saw in the chat there's a question. These slides will be available at the end of our session. And so you can have access to this then as well. Okay, so basically from this experiment, our research is really pointing towards that the benefits that students experience when counter-stereotypical scientists are highlighted in their courses are one of the drivers of those benefits is providing this humanizing information about the scientists who are featured in the courses. And again, some of the benefits for students, just to list them out here, include increased engagement with course content, like we saw in this research that I just presented, but also other studies have found that students see improved academic performance, increased interest in science, and increased persistence in science when they're in courses that feature counter-stereotypical scientists. However, if these resources are not implemented with care and intention, featuring scientists in classroom settings can be ineffective. And so, in other words, there can be costs for students in courses that feature counter-stereotypical scientists. So some examples of these costs, students holding excluded identities in courses that feature counter-stereotypical scientists may feel a heightened sense of stereotype threat or a heightened fear of negative evaluation for confirming stereotypes that are related to their excluded identities. And then thereby, they may feel more pressure to work hard to disprove these harmful stereotypes. Students may also feel tokenized if they think that their instructor is implementing these examples of counter-stereotypical scientists as nothing more than a symbolic gesture. And then further, when these resources or these materials that feature counter-stereotypical scientists highlight the struggles and difficulties that scientists have faced in their STEM careers, students may feel less enthusiastic about science, and they may feel that that path in science will be more difficult for them. And so these ideas that I've highlighted here were developed together with a large team of researchers and have been recently published as a 28-author essay, a large team of researchers. And so you can access that at this QR code here. And when we were developing these ideas, some of my colleagues and I realized that the data-versify quantitative biology activities that I just presented on that were used in that previous experiment really provide a great opportunity to test whether students think that the path in science will be more difficult for them after being exposed to the difficulties faced by scientists that were provided in that humanizing information or humanizing treatment. So we use the same experimental manipulation to ask, how does sharing scientists' obstacles impact how students describe the obstacles that they themselves would face as scientists? And so returning to these theoretical expectations for these different features of these resources that highlight counter-stereotypical scientists that are responsible for creating change, this study now is testing this third element. So it's exploring whether sharing the struggles faced by scientists is going to act to make the success of those scientists seem less attainable. And this is work that's being led by Pratibha, who's a graduate student at Auburn. And so at the end of the experiment, that I presented on, we asked students who participated in our study, do you think you would face obstacles as a scientist? And for those who said yes, they would face obstacles as a scientist, we asked, what obstacles do you think you would face? And we found that the majority of students, almost 88% of students, thought that they would face obstacles as a scientist, and that this response did not depend on the extent that the activities included humanizing information about the featured scientist. So this suggests that students are well aware that there are obstacles to be had in science, and that this is the case regardless of whether we highlight the obstacles that counter-stereotypical scientists have faced in their STEM careers. And so for these 865 students who said yes, they would face obstacles as a scientist, we found that most of the students mentioned that they would face obstacles within the process of science. So for example, students mentioned that they would face obstacles acquiring funding or sharing their research or getting results that don't support their hypothesis. We also found that students mentioned that they would face societal discrimination and bias in science, and this could be due to their gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. And there were a couple other obstacles that students thought they would face that, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into, but happy to discuss. But to answer a research question, we're interested in understanding whether sharing scientists' obstacles impacts how students describes the obstacles that they would face. And we found that the proportion of student responses mentioning these different types of obstacles, so whether they would have obstacles doing the process of science or facing societal discrimination within science, that it did not differ across our treatment groups. And so it didn't depend on whether these curricular materials highlighted obstacles faced by scientists. So returning to this table of our costs and benefits of featuring counter-stereotypical scientists in our undergraduate STEM courses, we're not really finding evidence to suggest that sharing obstacles faced by scientists causes students to think that their path in science will be difficult. Instead, students really are already aware of the obstacles that they might face in STEM. But students aren't the only individuals who interact with these curricular resources that highlight counter-stereotypical scientists. Instructors also are going to experience both benefits and costs when they feature counter-stereotypical scientists in their own undergraduate science courses. And that's kind of where we started our discussion, thinking about how do we as instructors feature counter-stereotypical scientists in our courses. And so I'm curious to hear what you think. What are some of those costs? What are some of the benefits that instructors might experience when featuring counter-stereotypical scientists in their science courses? And so as you consider this question, I'd like you to draw from your own experiences. And so we're going to go back into our breakout rooms and then spend a couple minutes there and then come back and discuss as a group. And here is our prompt.
All right, rooms are open.
Oh, I'm seeing there's so many questions. Yeah. Okay. All right, welcome back. Does anyone have something that they'd like to share out from what you all were discussing in your groups? I'm curious.
Well, our group definitely talked about the concern about tokenism, and that's a real thing, and especially coming from someone who doesn't meet one of those identities, it's tough. And you might be able to relate to someone in the class that is like you. Like sometimes I wander into a class with another professor, a male professor, and the girls in the class are like, hi, so that's easier, obviously, than relating to identities that don't have, that aren't your identity. So struggling with that, not wanting to use that sort of tokenism or be interpreted as tokenism, even if it's not intended that way.
Yeah, like inadvertently causing
more harm.
Yeah. Anyone else want to share some thoughts that you were all discussing with your group?
Yeah. So one of the concerns we had that it seems like as your data show, to do this treatment right, to humanize the person, to tell about their story, it takes more time. And it takes more knowledge and understanding of the instructor. It's much easier just to throw up a face than it is to throw up a face and talk about, what did they discover? How did they get there? And so, yeah, it's as often, especially in intro classes, when we're so low on time, it can be difficult.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, time constraints. Um, Speaking of time, we're time constrained, so I'm gonna switch back to sharing. But yeah, thank you for sharing it, and feel free to continue to put some of these different benefits and costs that instructors might face in the chat. Um, from what I heard, these are all like real things that as instructors we're thinking of in terms of benefits and costs. From this essay, we brainstormed some benefits and costs that we thought instructors might face, but obviously there's many more. So some benefits might include increased self-efficacy, validation, satisfaction from helping to diversify science, and perhaps some improved relationships with students. And some costs, like you just mentioned, the time and cognitive resources required to plan and implement. Another cost might be potential pushback from students, peer instructors, or institutions, and specifically pushback for implementing explicitly inclusive activities in your course. So this pushback may cause instructors to be hesitant to feature scientists with counter-stereotypical identities in their courses. And this was something that we thought we could also, again, test with using the same experiment manipulation. So to test whether these hesitations are founded, we realized that we could use the same data and to explore whether students express resistance to these materials that featured counter-stereotypical scientists. And student resistance has been defined in the literature as a suite of behaviors that relate or that reflect student frustration, detachment, or disengagement. And to measure student resistance to these data-versify activities, we read through student responses to 2 open-ended prompts to look for signs of frustration, detachment, disengagement. And we had asked these 2 prompts. So we asked students to describe how you related to the featured scientist in the activity, if at all, and what did you learn from this activity about the types of people who do science. We asked these questions as a way to measure the impact of our 3 different treatments, but they also provide students the opportunity to express resistance to the inclusion of counter-stereotypical scientists in their course activities. But I want to take a moment just to stress 2 quick points. First, these open-ended questions weren't intentionally designed to measure student resistance, so we may really be underestimating the extent to which students resist these types of inclusive activities. And second, measuring student resistance from written responses is a really difficult and subjective task. And so to help with the subjectivity of this task, we created a rubric. And we used a really broad definition of student resistance that I'm going to get into when I present the results. But we then read through over 6,000 student responses to these 2 open-ended prompts to identify any resistant responses using this rubric. And after we came to consensus on deciding which responses might be expressing resistance, we then coded these different resistant responses by these different types of resistance. And what we found is that students really express minimal resistance to activities that feature counter-stereotypical scientists. So out of these, over 6,000 responses, we found only 371 responses from 323 students that we flagged as resistance using our really broad definition of resistance. And then of those resistant responses, only 16 responses, or 0.25% of all our responses, were clearly resistance to the inclusivity of the activity. So ultimately, we find that very few students are expressing resistance to these activities that explicitly are highlighting scientists with identities excluded in STEM. And so the majority of these few resistant responses were aimed at the scientific topic of the activity instead of at the scientist. So as an example, one student wrote in response to the prompt to describe how they related to the scientist that I didn't feel like I really related to the scientist because I don't like insects, let alone do experiments on them. Another type of resistance that we commonly observed were just kind of absurd comments. So this example, a student worked through an activity that focused on crickets that lost their ability to sing, and the student wrote, "I'd call myself a silent cricket." Not sure if that's actually resistance or not, but we included it in our broad definition of what could be resistance. We also saw other types of resistance to doing the work of the activity or of filling out the survey, resistance to the survey question that's being asked, or resistance to the activity style. But again, we found that only 16 responses, or 0.25% of these responses, express resistance to the actual inclusive elements of the activity. And then we also saw that 12 responses express resistance to the inclusive elements of the activity, but in a way expressing that they weren't effective enough. So for example, one student wrote, "Surprise, surprise, science isn't limited to just old white men," which is this critique of these activities of not doing enough to move beyond representation of scientists holding diverse identities. And then finally, we found again that the student resistant was not impacted by the extent that the activities included humanizing information, so it wasn't impacted by our treatments. So students are just unlikely to express resistance regardless of the extent that students were exposed to information about counterstereotypical scientists. And so again, returning to our table of costs and benefits for featuring counterstereotypical scientists in our undergraduate STEM courses, we find some preliminary evidence that instructors are unlikely to actually experience this pushback from students for featuring counterstereotypical scientists in their classrooms. Although I do want to acknowledge that this data was collected in 2022, so that's before many of these anti-DEI policies that might embolden students to voice more objections to inclusive teaching practices. But there's one final group that we haven't discussed so far, and that are also going to experience costs and benefits for when courses highlight counterstereotypical scientists, and that's the featured scientists themselves. And so in this essay, we also brainstormed some of the benefits and costs that featured scientists might experience when they are featured in undergraduate STEM courses. And this is definitely an area for future investigation. And so today I described one experiment and how we use that experiment to explore 3 of these different proposed costs and benefits for featuring counterstereotypical scientists in our undergraduate biology courses. Clearly, there's a lot we still don't know about how to best feature scientists in our undergraduate STEM courses. And I would love to continue to have this conversation with you. So I'm asking you all to save the date, May 26th, 27th. Suan Yang and I are hosting a 2-day conversation at the University of Buffalo about how we reflect the real people who are scientists in our undergraduate biology courses. So, and also this is going to be held 2 days before Sabre East, if you're planning on attending that, which is in Rochester, New York. So come hang out in Western New York in May with me. And the goal of this conversation will be to continue to talk about best practices and to really form working groups to collaborate on designing curricular materials or also research projects that are centered around how we can best highlight counterstereotypical scientists in our undergraduate STEM courses. And so I look forward to continuing these discussions then. Before I open it up to answer any questions or continue this conversation now, I obviously need to acknowledge people, the Dataversify team. All this work that I presented today was done in close collaboration with these folks. And yeah, I'm happy to continue to chat with you all.
Thank you so much, Robin. And Robin has been kind enough to stay back a few minutes in case people have questions, because we are close to the top of the hour. This was lovely. And you know, the fusion of data and how that data can be implemented, right? Through discussions, through breakout rooms, that was really, really interactive and great. Some of the things that came up in the chat, I think Latonia asked, when was the data collected from your study? I wonder if the responses to the resistance prompts would be different today, like in this recent times.
Yeah, this data was collected in 2022, and because things change so quickly, I think that we might find some different amounts of resistance if we redid the study today. But who knows? It's worth looking into.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Cool.